Okay, we're Mem Zayin with Aleph, 47a, at the bottom of the page, the Mishnah. The Mishnah, this tractate, is discussing the laws of Eglah Rufa, the laws of, you can see it, yeah, there's the bold letters where it says Mem Saf Nun Yud. That stands from, it's an abbreviation from Mas Nisan, which means our Mishnah. All right, so this tractate, or this chapter in this tractate is discussing the laws of Eglah Rufa, the laws of the ritual done when there's an unresolved murder out of the city. We went through the entire process in great detail. The elders from Jerusalem come, measure to the nearest city. The elders of that city come out and perform a ritual, the center of which is the decapitation of a calf at a river. And the elders wash their hands, declaring that they were not aware of this person and they didn't do anything that would have led to his death. And had they known, they would have sent him with a company, which is how we got this whole discussion before by the company. They would have sent him with an entourage. They would have sent him with food, provisions, and so on. And therefore, they're asking of Hashem for atonement, and the Kohen comes and declares God's atonement. That's essentially the story. So I think we went through every detail of the process, right? I think so. I believe we did, meaning we started from the measuring all the way till the decapitation and the fact that the land upon which it's decapitated becomes barren forever. We also discussed how you bury the corpse there, right? Now this Mishnah is going to discuss who, or I should say when, the Eglah Rufa is disqualified. And the key here is that the Eglah Rufa procedure is for an unresolved murder. But if you know who the murderer is, there's no Eglah Rufa. You go find the murderer and put him on trial, right? And that's what the Mishnah is going to get into presently. So, Nimsa Hoirik, if the murderer, sorry?
The Sotah proceeding, guilt, innocence of the woman.
That's right. That's right. That's right. The parallel comes back. That's true. So we got into the Eglah Rufa because we were discussing all kinds of mitzvahs that require a speech of some sort. The Sotah has the Kohen administers an oath. By Eglah Rufa, the elders and the Kohen give a speech that we're not responsible, and we're asking for atonement. And that's how we got into this to begin with. But you're right; it's going to come back, and that's right. We're going to see in a moment how it's going to come back to connecting the Eglah Rufa to the Sotah. Also, just on a basic level, so what you're saying is that the similarity is that they both come to deal with unknowns. Right? We don't know who murdered this guy, that's what we're doing Eglah Rufa. And the Sotah is a woman behind closed doors with some other guy, and we don't know what they did behind closed doors. So that she drinks this water, and that's going to tell us whether she behaved or misbehaved behind those closed doors. So both of them deal with an unresolved case. Right? The difference is that the Sotah identifies whether she's guilty or innocent, and the Eglah Rufa doesn't. It just says, we're not guilty. We as in court, the people, leadership. Okay, so Nimsa Hoirik, if the murderer is found, Ad Shaloi Nerfa Gola, prior to the decapitation of the calf. So what happens to the calf now? Initially, the calf is not allowed to do any work if it's to be used for an Eglah Rufa. Right? It cannot be done, no work can be done. Now the Eglah Rufa is called off because we found the murderer. What do we do with this calf? So says the Mishnah, let it go out and pasture in the, let it go graze. It got the presidential pardon. Now it can go live out its happy life wherever. This is actually a matter, Rashi points out that this is actually a matter of dispute, and there is a view elsewhere that states that once it's been designated for Eglah Rufa, then it cannot be worked.
Kind of like a korban.
Similar to a korban, once it's designated.
Wait till it has a blemish, right?
Yeah, actually, that's correct.
It's enclosed until it dies.
Right. Yeah. So the Rashi points out that elsewhere the Gemara discusses that dispute, but here the view is let it go, have a good time, back to its normal life. So now, but Misha Nerfa Agala, if the murderer is found after decapitation, so it's too late. And the question is, well, what do you do now with this calf, first of all? Because there's a mitzvah that it has to be buried. The calf has to be buried on that spot, and that spot can't be worked. What happens now? We did the decapitation of the calf, and now they found the murderer. Says the Mishnah, to cover b'mukaima, let it be buried in its spot, meaning it's treated as if it was a proper egla rufa, and it's buried on the spot. Why? Shal safek basa mitchilasa. The whole idea of the egla rufa to begin with is on a doubt. So whether later you resolve that doubt or not doesn't undermine what we did at the time.
At that time,
At that time was a doubt, and that's the whole point. The point is to come for a doubt. When it comes to, say, let's say Sotah, where she's drinking the water because we want to find out what happened behind closed doors. Once we find out, it undermines what we were trying to do to begin with. But here, we knew there was a murderer. We just didn't know who it was. So to begin with, the whole thing is brought in a doubt. So at the time of bringing it, it was in doubt, as it should be. I'm not sure if Sotah is a good comparison.
maybe after she drinks,
I'm not sure.
After she drinks, they find out.
Then what?
Before
Then what? Too late already.
It's too late.
So the same thing happens here.
Exactly.
Yeah, so maybe I was trying to juxtapose it, but maybe not. Maybe it's actually compared. Anyway, because to begin with, the egla rufa is brought as a doubtful, as an issue of we don't know who the murderer is. At the time, we didn't know, so it's perfectly fine. And therefore, kipra sveka, the egla rufa atoned for the doubt as it was at the time, and it did its purpose. Literally means, and it goes on, as if to say, it did what it's supposed to do, and it has to continue to do what it's supposed to, which is to be properly buried, and that place becomes forbidden for work. Sorry? Would you still have the Kohen speech?
And also you have the sages.
Rashi makes no comment. It's a good question. If they find the murderer after the decapitation, before the speech. Wait, no, isn't the speech before the decapitation?
Oh, is it?
Decapitation is the last point. It's the last point of the process. Yeah, I think so, right?
I
believe so.
Yeah? I'm not sure.
It's in Rambam recently. Okay, we're going to learn the Rambam after we finish this chapter. Go through it's 2 or 3 chapters, and Rambam goes through the entire detail, the whole process. No, I don't remember. Drawing a blank. Anyway, okay. After the class, I'll look it up on Rambam. Okay. Nerfa Agala, if the calf was decapitated, and after decapitation, Nimtza Hayreg, the murderer was found. So this murderer is tried, and if he's found guilty, he himself is killed, as is the law for any murder. In other words, the point the Mishnah is telling us is not to assume that, hey, we got atonement, so just leave it alone. Sorry?
No, I thought not to assume that he's guilty.
Well, for sure not to assume he's guilty, but you could have, one might have thought that if we did the egla rufa and we got atonement, there's no reason to try the murderer at all, because we already got atonement. So says the Mishnah, no, even if they find the murderer, a year later, they find him. Yeah, so a year later, witnesses arrive and say, we saw such and such event.
Witnesses and
The whole thing happens, that's right. So he's tried for murder. Now, Eid Echad Omer Isi Esen Hoyreg. One witness comes along and says, I saw the murderer. I saw it. One witness. By Torah law, one witness doesn't count for anything. Or I shouldn't say it doesn't count for anything. Doesn't count enough to convict someone. So, but one person comes and says, I know the murderer. Now, if we know the murderer, we can't do the egla rufa. But Eid Echad Omer, another witness comes and says, Loida Isa, you didn't see. How is one supposed to know if he saw or not? How am I supposed to know if you saw or not?
He was in another place.
I was with you at the same time. You're claiming you saw him on Tuesday at this in this corner. Not, yeah, so it's not true. I was with you having dinner in some other restaurant on the other side of town. So it couldn't have been that you saw. So they cancel each other out, essentially. Likewise, Isha Meres Ra'isi, a woman comes and says, I saw the murderer. Now again, just as with a single witness, a woman's testimony cannot convict someone. But here she comes and says to me, I saw the murderer. The Isha Meres, and a woman comes and says, Loya Isa, no, you didn't see her. You did not see the murderer. You were with me somewhere else at the time. So Hayo Oifrin, they would go through with the decapitation because we're stuck at square one where we don't know anything because they've canceled each other out. It's not as if we have even shaky information.
Does she get punished for that? Or is that
I don't think so.
because it's only one?
I don't know. I don't think so. No. Okay. Eid Echad, one witness comes and says, Ra'isi, I saw the murderer or the murderer. The Shnayim Oimrim, and two witnesses come along and say, Lo Ra'isa, you didn't see. So here we have bona fide witnesses canceling out a non-bona fide witness, which is a single testimony. So certainly here, we're back at this beginning where we don't know who murdered, right? Because one guy claims he saw and the two guys claim he didn't. Yeah. So Hoya Orphan, they would then do the process of the decapitation because why not? We're back to square one. We don't know anything. What about the reverse? Shnayim Oimrim Ra'inu, two people come along and say, we saw the murder. And one comes along and tells them, Loida Isam, you didn't see it.
Are witnesses equal? The one witness and one witness, is it the same if one, let's say, is a rabbi, a leader, a tzaddik, and then the other?
By Torah law, it's the exact same.
It's the exact same.
Yeah, his social status.
One who's like, let's say, part of that group said, I didn't see, and then tzaddik, rabbi says, I saw.
As long as he's a kosher witness, and there is a certain level of wickedness which would make the person an invalid witness. Period. If he's a compulsive gambler, he's there's certain things that disqualify someone from being a witness. But assuming that he's kosher for being a witness, it makes a difference if his social status or his scholarship is not relevant to the court.
Function of observance as well.
His function of observance, unless he crosses certain lines which disqualify him, like a Machal Shabbos B'Farhesia.
Two is stronger than one.
Two is certainly stronger than one. So in this case, you have two guys saying we saw the murder, and one guy saying we didn't. One guy saying you didn't. So the one guy who says you didn't see the murder, his testimony is invalid, which means we're left with two people who say we saw the murder. Now, even though we don't have the murderer now, he could be off somewhere else, but it is now known to the court who the murderer is, because the court has accepted testimony of two people that say we know the murderer.
We saw, but do they know?
They know who it is.
They know who it is.
They know who it is. If so and so killed this guy at this time, we saw it happen.
Yeah.
So even though the court doesn't have him at the moment, he's off. He ran off, but it's known to the court now who it is, and therefore there's no egla rufa.
So this is all before the egla rufa.
That's correct.
There's a requirement for two witnesses, aren't there?
That's right. Well, actually, if one person says he knows, we don't do the egla rufa if there's no one contradicting him. Because it's no longer a mystery murder, even though we can convict the other guy. But in this case, you have
one person says that he saw.
Yeah,
enough to not do egla rufa.
That's correct. If no one contradicting him. If someone contradicts him, then we're back to square one.
Cross-examined and everything, right?
Yeah.
The contradiction always has to take the form of two witnesses, yeah?
If it's 1-to-1, they cancel each other out.
Right. So
If it's 2-to-1, then the two cancel out the one completely. So if it's 2-to-1 where two say you didn't and one says yes, then we do the egla rufa because the two say you didn't see. So we cancel his testimony.
In the canceling out scenario,
which way? Who says what?
The accused says he didn't, and
So the accused is not here.
That's right.
The accused is not here. It's witnesses. So two guys say we saw the murderer. He's off in China, and one guy says no, you weren't there.
Right.
So we accept the testimony of those two, and therefore we don't do the egla rufa because it's now known to us who the murderer is. Right. So that's what it says here. Shnaim oimrim ra'inu. Two guys say we saw the murderer. V'echad oimrim, one says lo ra'isem, you did not see them. Lo yo'oifrim, they would not do the eglarufa because it is now known to us who the murderer is because we have two witnesses. Now comes a few interesting historical factoids. Okay. Misha Rabor Haratzchonen. Once murder became rampant. Batla eglarufa. They stopped to do the eglarufa. And as Rashi explains, because now we cannot claim it is not known to us who the murderer is. We have a list of 10 guys in the town. We know who would have done it. We know who they are. There are known murderers running around. It's not as if it's unknown to us. The whole thing here is that we as community leaders we have a solid city. We know how to control our population. We know how to take care of our visitors. And we failed here, so we're asking Hashem for atonement. But in the case where there's rampant murderers,
outside.
And it was outside the city. That's correct.
Someone maybe.
Or maybe maybe someone somewhere else. We don't know who he is. Exactly. Some guy we have no idea who he is. Okay, we can't claim any responsibility. But we know in our town, which means as leadership, we are failing. Because we have a list of 10 murderers. What are we to come and say? We don't know the murderers, or it's not our fault?
Then you can't take
You can't do that. Exactly. Exactly. So once murder, that's correct. That's it. So once they know the murderers, they can't do that. So the Gemara now gives an example of someone who would have been known as a murderer. Now it's a very interesting thing that the Mishnah is bringing up because to us it's almost irrelevant because we don't know his name, and the Gemara is going to give us his nickname or two nicknames, and we don't know what those are either. Yeah, we don't know what those are either. But it's the Mishnah still puts it here. Now I'm assuming the reason why the Mishnah puts it here is to tell us what would qualify as murder rampant. Murder would be rampant when you have a nickname for a guy because he's a murderer. That would be murder is rampant. So let's see. The Gemara gives an example. Mishaba Eliezer ben Dinai. When a fellow named Eliezer, son of Dinai, arrived, Vitrina ben Prisha Yonikra. He was called Trina ben Prisha. Now, Rashi doesn't explain why he was called Trina ben Prisha, but we can use a little imagination to figure that out. Trina means supplication, and Prisha means separation. Maybe because people would beg him, please don't kill me, and he wouldn't care.
He's the separator.
Separator, that's the nickname here. Trina ben Prisha. Now, Chazru, when he returned, or they returned, L'Kroise to call him Ben Haratzchon, son of a murderer, or the murderer. In Hebrew, when you want to describe someone who has a description, you would call him Ben. Like a bar mitzvah, it means a son of mitzvah, because now the kid acquired the obligation for mitzvahs. Right, so it's like or we had like Rabbi bar Chana, Rabbi son of Bar Chana. Bar Chana means the son of the gracious one. The person must have been gracious. They called him the son of the gracious one. So here they call him son of a murderer, because he's a murderer. So he wasn't just called Trina ben Prisha, which maybe somehow is like a hint to his being a murderer, but they straight out call him the murderer. If that's the kind of situation where you have a guy walking around town who is actually titled the murderer, then Eglah Ruf is called off because you obviously cannot control your population.
So there's no inquiry into it within murder.
Well, they can't convict him unless they have the proper witnesses. Okay, the Gemara is going to discuss a little bit more what you do when murder is rampant and how you deal with that. The only other modern version I can think of a guy who has a nickname as a murderer is like in the mafia.
Yeah. Me 2 times.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody 2 times.
Or exactly. We have some guy who's known as, I don't know what, because of his. That's the only modern version I could think of. Like I imagine, think of today's day. Like when they find the body, based on how they find it and where they found it, they could probably figure out very quickly which gang killed him and who. Yeah, based on who he's murdered, how he was murdered, where he's murdered. They can often find. They already know who the person who did it.
Right, they just can't prove it.
Can they convict the person? Not necessarily, because they don't have enough to go on, but they know what's going on. So presumably that's a similar thing here. They have a guy who's got a nickname murderer, and they see someone.
So this is technically, I think, there's no Eglah Rufa.
So there's no Eglah Rufa here, yeah.
It's the community's fault. For this
That's what it seems like. It seems like the leadership is failing miserably when they have a guy walking around whose nickname is murderer.
Yeah.
Okay, so on that note, the Gemara now brings it back to Sotah. Okay, Mishirabu Hamanafim, when infidelity became rampant. Pasku Hamayim Hamardim, they stopped using the bitter waters. Right, the Sotah law is a woman who was warned not to seclude herself with a certain fellow, and she did, and she claims nothing happened. We were just talking. But we don't know. He suspects her of infidelity. So he takes her to the temple and she drinks the water of the Sotah. This is the entire chapter. This is the whole tractate up until this last chapter. Up until the last chapter in Eglah Rufa, that's been the discussion of bulk of what we're learning here. So now the Gemara tells us that when there was too much infidelity, they stopped doing it. And the reason for this, as Rashi explains it for us, where's Rashi here? Yeah, Rashi doesn't explicitly state this, but it seems that this is correct. We had this way back at the beginning of the tractate, that if the husbands themselves are unfaithful, they themselves are promiscuous, then the Sotah water is of no use because they themselves are culpable. And therefore, if here is not the issue is not the wives that are being promiscuous. It's because men have become promiscuous. What are they going to start doing? Dragging their wives to the temple to find out if they were misbehaving? Look at yourselves. So they called it off. They called off the whole Sotah thing because men were misbehaving. The Gemara even tells us here what time, when it was. The Mishnah, tells us when that actually happened. So the murder, the Mishnah doesn't tell us when. It just tells us a person's name, which we don't know. I don't know when to place him. But when they stopped the Sotah waters, that we know when to place it. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Hifsikon. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is the one who called it off. He's the one that stopped the Sotah water. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is the leading Jewish scholar at the time he was Nasi at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. He lived through the destruction of the Second Temple. He's the one that the Gemara describes in Gittin, incredible story of how he was, when Jerusalem was under siege, how they snuck him out in a coffin, making as if they were going to bury him, and he was alive. They took him out, and he went to meet Vespasian, who at the time was the Roman general, but then became the Roman emperor. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai predicted he was going to become the Roman emperor, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai negotiated with Vespasian to keep the yeshiva alive, to keep 10 liyavna v'chachama. He negotiated to keep the sages alive just before the destruction. So we know when to place Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and that would be the time when the Sotah law was called off, right? So we talked about yesterday the lack of leadership that existed at the end of the Second Temple period, right? When we were talking about that yesterday, just all kinds of lack of leadership doesn't just lead to false messiahs, as we discussed yesterday, but the lack of leadership leads to promiscuity. It's lawlessness as a whole. So why not do whatever we want? This thing, it spills over into everything. It's like there's Giuliani, to detour a little bit, but Giuliani, he cleaned up New York, crime rate in New York, because he followed this philosophy, which I think is called the broken glass philosophy. You know what I'm talking about? The idea is that if you take a bunch of kids and you put them in front of a building and 3 of the windows are broken, there's 100 windows in the building, but they see three windows broken, so they assume, no one cares about the building anyway, might as well break more, right? Because, well, why not? So what Giuliani did was, following that theory, is instead of chasing the bank robbers and the organized crime, he cracked down on petty crime, on jaywalking, on littering. Sorry?
He then escalated that from petty crime. They went to higher levels.
Right, but the streets got cleaned up.
Yeah, exactly.
And it became more comfortable to roam the streets. Because a kid walks down the street and sees garbage and sees someone jaywalking, he says, I'll throw a glass bottle also.
They did the same thing on the subways. They cleaned up the subways.
That's right, and it brought crime down. That's right. So I think a similar thing is here. What does the leadership have to do with my promiscuity? Nothing. But when there's a lack of leadership, no one cares anyway. The whole morality is out the window. So it would follow that in the time of Rabbi and Zakkai, where they had all this kind of broken leadership, that promiscuity would be rampant, and thus they called off the Sotah law, which is pretty remarkable. The Sotah drinking went all the way through the Second Temple period. It's for a long time. It's from, let's say, it's from the time that King Solomon built the first temple, or you go back even further, from the Mishkan time, from Moshe Rabbeinu's time, to the end of the second Beis Mikdash. That's what, almost 2,000 years? Right, almost more than 2,000 years. It's a long time. Anyway, so the Gemara now cites, the Mishnah cites to a verse, backing up this idea that once there's too much promiscuity, the Sotah is called off. Too much promiscuity amongst men. Shenemar, as the verse reads, "Lo efkoid al b'nei seichem," I will not punish your daughters. Ki tizninen, I'm not pronounce this word. Where is the pasuk?
Women.
Ki tiznena. So the simple reading is, because I won't punish them when they misbehave, when they behave like harlots. But the reading the Mishnah is doing here is, I won't punish your daughters because you guys are hanging out with harlots. Not because they are, but because you guys are. And the same thing about kalei seichem ki tzifa'ena, and I won't punish your daughter-in-laws when they misbehave, kiheim goimer, because they are hanging out with lewd women. That's what the verse goes on to say. And the they here is not the women, but the men, because the men are misbehaving. Okay. Now, having stated times in history when things came to an end, Eglah Rufa came to an end when murder was rampant. Sotah called off when infidelity is rampant amongst men. So likewise, Mishemes Yossi ben Ye'ezer ish Tzereda, v'Yossi ben Yehuda ish Yerushalayim. When Yossi ben Ye'ezer of Tzereda and Yossi ben Yehuda from Yerushalayim died, Batlo hashkolos, the clusters ended. Ashkolos is like a cluster of grapes. Now, what that means is, what that's referring to is the unity amongst Jews ended when they passed away. So until such time, anything that was, there were disputes in terms of how to apply the 13 principles of interpretation. That always existed, as Rambam writes in his introduction to Mishnah. But there were no disputes about what Moshe Rabbeinu himself said. And once they passed away, there start to become disputes even about what Moshe Rabbeinu himself said. So the cluster, the unity of Torah learning, ended with Yossi ben Yezer and Yossi ben Yehuda, which again is earlier in the Second Temple period.
The Shmoy's book. There was the new Kutas book.
No idea. Okay. So Shenemar, as the verse reads. Once again, pull up the file. Let's pull up the verse. Micha 7:1. That would be in Tuvim. Wait, where is it now? It's going to be in the VM. Sorry. 7, verse 1. So the verse reads, "Woe is to me, for I am as fat as the figs, like the gleanings of the vintage. There is no cluster to eat. The first ripe fig my soul desires." Okay, so what's that we're speaking to? Says our Mishnah, in Eshkol Lechol, there's no cluster to eat. My soul desires the fig. This is an allusion to this idea that there's no more unity amongst the Jewish people.
Were the clusters.
Sorry?
Were the clusters of kosher eating.
Yeah, well, it seems like the leadership issue. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop over here because the Gemara is going to introduce. There's really only a few more lines to the Mishnah, but as Rashi points out, the Mishnah doesn't explain itself. The Gemara is going to explain what it means, so we'll get to that, God willing, tomorrow. Okay, wonderful day, Yidden. Oh, we want to look up that Rambam. Let's look it up. Oops. Yeah, what are we looking up? We want to see.
Conan's, is it after the? Because he says, doesn't say anything about washing their hands.
Yeah, so it's in It's in the end of the laws of murder, so it's going to be in the Zikin. I think it's the last 2 or 3 chapters. No, it's before then. Yeah. No, you're right. The washing of the hand comes after the decapitation.
We wash the hands, and in the verse it says something about we washed our hands of this.
Yeah. Yeah,
But anyway, I would have presumed that wouldn't happen.
that's interesting.
Because
If they found the murder between the decapitation and the washing of the hands, I imagine they wouldn't.
they wouldn't do it. Because
Yeah. But nonetheless, the
making
spot,
a false statement.
right? But nonetheless, they would still bury the calf on the spot,
Yeah. Well, yeah.
and they would still make that place no longer allowed to work, even if they would stop at that point and not wash their hands.
Said at the time of doing it, there was a doubt.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Have a good day. That does seem to be correct. Okay, have a good day, Eden.